Welcome to the Embodiment Podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with specialists from around the world. I'm your host for today, Mark Walsh. So on the show today, Heather Mason. So Heather founded something called the Minded Institute. She's working a lot with yoga therapy. She's recently been in the British Parliament, all kinds of qualifications in yoga therapy, MA in Buddhist studies. What else? Another MA in psychotherapy and MSc in medical physiology. So this person's got a lot of qualifications.
Thank you.
And, I've only met her once, but I'm looking forward to this. Heather, welcome.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. Thank you for that very kind introduction.
And how did you get interested in the body? What was your journey into this?
That's an interesting question to say it like that, because it actually pushes me even further back. You know, I was a gymnast when I was younger. So I guess I've always been interested in the body and movement. But I didn't get involved in yoga in any way until I was 19 years old. I did a semester abroad, or I think in the UK you would say a term abroad from uni, and I went to study in India. And yoga class was actually one of the required pieces of our curriculum. But because I was a competitive gymnast, I didn't understand what yoga was. For me, it was just an adult form of gymnastics. And I didn't understand how to practice and what it meant really until I was 23, when I brought mindfulness into it.
Okay, so you had this introduction out there, and how did the Minded Institute that you now run, how did that get started? Maybe you could say a little bit about what that is and the birth of that.
Well, it's quite a long story. I'll try not to make it like super long, but we also have time. So at the age of 19, after practicing yoga and having been at university in New York, I started to realize on that trip that psychologically I wasn't really doing very well. And even though the plan was that I would return to my university education in New York, the idea of remaining in the environment I had grown up in was becoming less and less tenable for me, not just palatable, but I couldn't see how I could do it. I didn't see how I could function. So I actually dropped out of my university in New York and went to the University of Hawaii. I think I was trying to get as physically far away from New York and still be in the United States as humanly possible. And I finished my education out there. And then I had to come back to New York because I didn't have the resources to afford to stay out there. Mm-hmm. And I became deeply, deeply depressed. I became even more anxious than I had always been after living in New York for about a year. And I had an undergraduate degree in anthropology, another undergraduate degree, but that was the one I was focusing on. And I was working in the American Museum of Natural History and just getting less and less able to make it in my life. So much to the dismay of my family, I decided I was going to take off and I was going to travel around the world for 3 years and try and find myself. But in secret, I just wanted to escape. And it sounded like a good plan. And I told them I was going to do a PhD in anthropology and I was going to seek the culture I was going to study. But really, I just wanted to get away as fast as I could. And very soon into my journey, in fact, in the first country I traveled, I met this Buddhist monk, which was in Korea, who it's a really long story, probably even too long for this hour talk. But he got me to stay in his monastery in Korea and just said to me, "You sit," and made me meditate. I didn't really know what I was doing. And then the next country on my travels was Indonesia, and I met this guy who said to me, you know, I needed to go to a monastery in Thailand. And everywhere I went, everywhere I turned, was somebody trying to get me to practice mindfulness meditation. And so I started to devote my life to that and to the practice of yoga. And I got to the point where, first of all, I trained to be a yoga teacher. And secondly, where I thought I would become a Buddhist nun. That was really the path that I thought I would walk, because I started to feel like I could manage life and I could manage my mind. And as I was getting deeper into these practices, I thought, well, all my teachers are saying different things, especially the Buddhist teachers. And if I'm going to shave my head and give up everything, I want to make sure that I have clarity around what I'm doing. So as University London, it was the first time that they were offering a master's degree in Buddhist studies. And I thought to myself, okay, I'll come here, I'll do that degree. Then I'll have clarity as to what I should actually be practicing. And then I'll come back and I'll ordain. But what I learned is that there is no one thing that the Buddha taught. That was completely silly notion I had. And actually, the more you go into the text, the more you realize you just have to extrapolate from it what works for you and train under the feet of a teacher, or at the feet of a teacher that you really trust. And I ended up also falling in love, and suddenly the monastery didn't seem as enticing as it had. And I moved to Asia for a while again, because actually my meditation practice had almost all been in Asia. I moved back there, and I was practicing yoga and meditation, and I was teaching. And I was actually living in Taiwan, teaching yoga full-time out there. And then I'm trying to think. Then I came back to the UK, and I decided to do a master's degree in psychotherapy, because as I started to heal, I wanted to be able to help other people to do the same. And it was a Buddhist-based psychotherapy. And there was always like these little buts in every career path I went down, but I didn't actually want to use talking as my major modality, because it wasn't how I myself healed. So then, whilst I was doing that degree, I took a sabbatical, and I was doing that in London. I hope all of what I'm saying is like weaving together, because it was quite a complex story. But I took a sabbatical. I went to India, and I trained to be a yoga therapist. And then I came back to the UK, and I thought, okay, I'm going to be a yoga therapist that focuses on mental health, because I know that from my own experience. And I'm almost done with my master's in psychotherapy, and my master's degree in Buddhist studies. My dissertation was on Buddhist-based psychology. So everything had been drawing towards that point. And so I started doing that, and there were loads of people, because I would try and read research that had come out. This was around 2007, and look at what other people were doing in terms of yoga therapy to help with people's mental health. And there was really no evidence base for it. And I thought, no, I'm not doing this. Like, I know what it's like to feel hopeless. I felt hopeless my whole life, and I'm not going to come up with some quick scheme to help somebody else. So I started studying neuroscience, actually. And I put together an 8-week course for depression and anxiety based on my own experience, including mindfulness and yoga therapy, kind of weaving them and integrating them together. And also starting to understand the effects that breathing could have on brain functioning, that movement had on brain functioning, that mindfulness had on brain functioning, either known or theoretically understood. And from that, I guess the Minded Institute was born, because other people became interested in it. There was nobody else in the UK at that time really focusing on yoga's effect on the brain, and other people wanted to train. So it was originally called Yoga for the Mind, my company, but I changed it to the Minded Institute. And then my original trainings were all about using yoga for mental health, but then it grew to focus on physical health problems, anatomical musculoskeletal issues. And that's when I did my final master's in medical physiology, so that I would have an understanding of that as well. And it's amazing, yesterday I just had my team over. I do these like office spa days so that everybody can come and join. And we were just talking about how much it's grown. It's amazing how something can be so organic from your experience. And one day you wake up and you're like, wow, all of this has been created and all these people are part of it. And it's amazing. So that's my long story.
So I guess what the Minded Institute is well known for is what you said, this scientific emphasis on the evidence base and the neuroscience. So can you say a little bit more about that decision?
Well, it was really because I felt that there were a lot of hocus pocus kinds of schemes being taught or suggested to individuals, and I didn't want to do that. And I wanted to be able to have a clear correlation between practices and their effects, because when you have PTSD, when you're suffering with an eating disorder, when you're depressed, when you're anxious, whatever it is, you feel so hopeless. And so since the brain is the physical, tangible element from which we can best understand the mind, I wanted to have that insight. And it's quite incredible. You know, the amount of research regarding yoga's impact on the brain is still quite small, but it's exciting and it's profound. And we can also, from other fields of research, like exercise research, stretching research, breath research, deduce a lot of things regarding yoga's potential to impact brain functioning. And one thing I would like to say is it's really surprising, I think, and people are always shocked, that simply altering one's breath, especially slowing it down, can have such a marked effect on the brain in a short period of time, invoking relaxation, or if we talk physiologically, parasympathetic response. And it's not hard, and you don't even need to get out a mat. You know, you can do it walking down the street or sitting on the bus or in your car or in the middle of working. Anyway.
Maybe you could say some more about some of the research that does exist then. I mean, you know, what are some of the kind of main findings in terms of the effects of yoga?
So I think that I think that for me, the one that is most notable is the research that's been done on GABA. So GABA is one of the two main neurotransmitters in the brain. The two are GABA and glutamate. Glutamate is excitatory, whereas GABA is inhibitory. And GABA is associated with calm, positive mood, and particularly GABA, the neurotransmitter GABA, is able to inhibit fear-based pathways. I mean, the story is more complicated than that, but we'll keep it at that level for now. And Chris Streeter, who is a researcher at the Boston University School of Medicine, has now conducted 3 different research trials looking at yoga's ability to increase GABA levels. And just so that we understand, the drug class called benzodiazepines, and if you don't know what benzodiazepines are, you probably know some of the drugs under there, especially some of the retail names like Valium and Xanax. They all fall under that. Help to increase levels of GABA in the brain, or they release GABA in the brain. So what she found in her first trial in 2007 was that yoga could increase brain GABA levels. So that was really exciting. But her detractors said, well, maybe any kind of movement can do that, and maybe that's really nothing to do with yoga. And she took that criticism very seriously. And so she applied for another grant from the US government, and she compared yoga against a walking group. And there were so many matched variables. It was a really nice, very tight research trial, not a big one, but very well done. And she showed that yoga statistically significantly improved GABA levels in comparison to a walking intervention. And most recently, she did the same thing, looking at yoga's ability to increase GABA levels in a depressed population. Now, unfortunately, she hasn't published those results yet, although she published part of her study. But I know, because I know her fairly well, I know that she found that. There's been other brain research as well, but I think that that's probably the tightest finding. We also know that, for example, do you want me to say anything else, or is that enough? Or should I say a few other,
Let's give me a couple more. This is your real expertise, so it's lovely to share that with people.
Okay, great. So we know as well that yoga can increase something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is usually abbreviated as BDNF. And this is a protein complex. And essentially, it's associated with neuroplasticity. So if the word neuroplasticity is new to the people listening, neuroplasticity is the capacity of the brain to change and the brain to grow. You can have negative neuroplasticity, but generally it's associated with positive change when we talk about it in terms of research. And BDNF is often called the fertilizer of neuroplasticity. So one of the things that it helps to do is it allows neurons to create new connections with other neurons, so it grows pathways, and that's by the growth of something called a dendrite. A dendrite picks up signals from another neuron. Also, and for me possibly more intriguing, we know that the brain can actually give birth to new neurons, and BDNF is a required chemical necessary for that to happen. So pharma companies, when they look at a drug to impact mental health, want to make sure that it can increase BDNF. And so researchers since 2013 have been looking at yoga's ability to do that. And in every trial, and there's only been a few, they have found that yoga actually can increase BDNF. And in the first one, in 2003, that it can increase BDNF actually as much as various different kinds of medications, which is super cool. Now, I should say, on the other hand, any kind of exercise probably also increases BDNF. So it's not specific to yoga, but nonetheless, it's an exciting finding. We also know that yoga can increase hippocampal volume. The hippocampus is a part of the brain implicated in many, many different things. It's implicated in our memory. It's the structure most notable for actually giving birth to these new neurons that I just talked about. That process is known specifically as neurogenesis. It's also involved in our spatial memory. It's also involved in resilience, many, many different things. And in one study, looking at an older bunch of individuals, after 6 months, hippocampal volume increased. And that's exciting because it declines with age. And I think that the researchers had just hoped that the volume would plateau, but it actually grew. And without citing every single study, I'll just say one other, which I really like. That study was published last year by Afonso, A-F-O-N-S-O, if our listeners want to look it up. And their group wanted to know if yoga practice was associated with greater thickness in a part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex, as the name suggests, is in the frontal part of the brain. And colloquially, we say that this is involved in executive functioning. Executive functioning is the ability to effectively manage competing goals, so like a lot of information from different brain structures, to respond effectively to different stimuli, to look at things from the new mind, not in a habitual way, and also to downgrade fear and distress. So across the board of mental health issues, we find that the prefrontal cortex is actually thinner, unfortunately. Hence, these specific faculties I just spoke about are compromised, as we know. And so what these researchers did was they looked at the brains of older women who had practiced yoga for 8 to 14 years on average, and wanted to see if their prefrontal cortices were thicker than those who didn't. And in fact, they were, suggesting this protective effect against both aging and mental health issues with yoga practice. But of course, detractors would say, because I think that it's really important that as we understand yoga research, that we also don't oversell it, because the medical community doesn't like that. And I like to speak to the medical community, but to really speak honestly about it. So the detractors would say, well, maybe people with thicker prefrontal cortices are the ones that start practicing yoga. So maybe that was always the case. So we do need more research to start with people with prefrontal cortices and see changing over time. But this is a really good start. And interestingly, other research has shown that people who practice yoga tend to be more anxious and depressed than people who don't in the beginning. So it's unlikely. It's unlikely.
Yogis are fucking crazy. That's what you're saying. I got it. I heard that.
A little nuts. I mean, there's you and I have a feeling that behind the scenes we're pretty crazy. Yeah.
And basically, Mark's quick summary there is yoga's good for your noggin. So there is a difference in culture as well, isn't there, between in yoga, it's traditional to kind of say it's the amazing cure-all for everything. And then scientific research community tends to be quite cautious, quite conservative, for want of a better word, in kind of making big claims. So it's nice to be specific. It strikes me there's a few challenges here. Like one is control group, as you mentioned, like versus exercise, for example, exercise without mindfulness as a control. Another one, I guess, is consistency. Like you say, like yoga is good for X. I mean, what kind of yoga? And, is it the balances? Is it the nature of the relationship with the teacher? Is it the studio? Is it what style of yoga? Is it the stretching or the breathing? Is it the physicality or the being aware of the physicality? It strikes me there's a a devilish number of variables there in any study on, in air quotes, yoga, because there's so much that could go within what constitutes yoga.
So I think this is a really brilliant point, Mark, and it's brought up by the yoga research community. It's brought up by people reading yoga research within the healthcare community, and I think you're spot on. What I should say, first of all, is regardless of the type of yoga that is being researched, because studies look at various different types of yoga because people will be interested in this kind or that kind, results are by and large positive. So that's important to note. I don't think that one type of yoga is better than any other type of yoga. However, as a yoga therapist, I definitely think that certain types of yoga are better for specific populations of people presenting with a particular health issue, and also particular times in people's trajectory of treatment. Now, the other point that you pick up as to what components of yoga are the most effective, it's a really good question, and we're trying to tease that out now. Is it everything together? Is it one component? And certainly, I think like yogis, like you and I, at least I could speak for myself, I don't really care if it's just this or just that. I want the whole package. I want the classical way of doing practice. But when you try and implement it within the health services, there's this desire to kind of give the very bare bones because everybody's coming from different worldviews. People have super busy lives, and everybody wants to do the least that they have to do to get the maximum results.
The minimal effective dose, as they say in medicine.
Yes.
And also,
exactly.
Like, do I have to do a headstand? I don't like headstands. I always hurt my neck doing headstands. Is that pose necessary? Or do I have to chant? Because someone might have a religious objection to that. I mean, there are some pretty fair and, objections or cultural barriers to saying Om, for example. Is it just the length of the out-breath that's important? Or is it actually the sound of Om? I think these are fair questions.
They're great questions, and we really don't know the answers yet, but I definitely feel that regardless of your religious belief, you can practice yoga in a way that you're comfortable with. There are enough practices that will give rise to enough benefit that if this or that aspect of it doesn't ring true with you, you're worried about safety or religious beliefs, that you can do something else. But I love that whole, is it Om itself? Is it vibration? Is it elongation of exhale? Personally, I think it's just the mix of vibration and the elongation of exhale. I think if I were to chant, Mark, all day long, that would probably deeply improve my well-being.
Nice. And I mean, in terms of the sort of general yoga class, I mean, do you have, I guess, you're saying this intuitively, it's not firmly established scientifically. Do you have a sense of what are the most kind of healthy parts of the class for mental health? I mean, for example, I think one is just being around a really positive community of people who have this intention, that even if we're all just laying brick instead of doing yoga, or if we're all playing tiddlywinks, being around that community is hell of a beneficial. Or is it mostly just the stretching, some sort of endorphin effect from the stretching? Like, what's your best guess as to what are the really...
I could easily answer this question for the rest of the time we're going to talk. But okay, so let me start with the first piece, which is the social aspect. The reduction in social isolation that people experience by going to a yoga class, I think, is probably one of its significant offerings. In fact, the NHS, in recognizing how important it is for people to be in groups where they feel safe, has this whole social prescribing scheme where people can be on the NHS offered various different activity groups that they can go to. And through those activity groups, they improve their health behaviors, their well-being, their mental health. And I think something that's super cool about yoga, which you're not going to find in many activity groups, is you're not making eye contact and you're not speaking to each other in the process. You don't have to worry about getting something wrong. As somebody who previously experienced pretty significant social anxiety, I know how relaxing it was to know I could be in a group of people, but I didn't have an opportunity to really screw anything up, but I felt part of something. So that was really supportive. So that's a big piece of it. And then,
yes, just if I jump in there, I'd say there's also a bit of a risk in that, on the one hand, it's super safe and it's super easy because you can be in a social sense of belonging, a sense of shared movement, which creates that kind of, that peace which is lacking from our society that cultures have, of moving in a group together as a way of feeling that tribe, that social support without having to interact. And a comparison would be a 12-step group. I was in one this morning where you're equally in that group, you talk, but you're only allowed to talk in certain ways. No one's allowed to talk to each other during a 12-step meeting.
Yeah.
Become what's called cross share, which basically means talking to each other. And I think it's another good example of a sort of mediated togetherness socially with a kind of ritualistic element that is similar to yoga. But I always think there's a bit of a risk though in this. I remember as I started doing more yoga coming from Aikido, which is much more socially interactive, I found it quite strange that everyone was on their little mat on their own, kind of socially isolated. I found that a bit limiting in some ways, though I totally get why it would be super cool if you were, very socially anxious, for example.
Well, actually, the next thing, because I think that's a really important point, and I was about to say like the next piece, but actually you picked it up, and I'm really happy that you did, because otherwise people don't learn how to be social in the world. They only learn that they can be in this environment in these completely controlled, restricted circumstances, which isn't actually healthy. The thing is, okay, so you sit in the class or you move in the class for an hour and a half, however long it is, and you're with people in an environment where you can't say the wrong thing or make uncomfortable eye contact necessarily. And then something happens. Because of the nature of the practices that you should do for mental health, for most mental health conditions, not all, which are those which are parasympathetic in nature, those that would, for example, because you asked about what kind of practices one should do, involving like slow, elongated exhalation. Somebody should leave the class feeling relaxed. And I don't know how much physiology you want me to get into. You can say, after I say this piece, you could say, Heather, can you elaborate on that? But there's something called our social engagement network, something which was defined by this amazing mind-body researcher, psychiatrist named Stephen Porges, who's very famous in the field of therapy. And when the parasympathetic system is activated, that social engagement system is activated. So what would happen theoretically at the end of class is, after having that time without having to worry too much and being next to people, you could then exit the class, go into the changing room, and feel like, oh, I feel good. I feel like I could talk to other people and just have like normal, engaged conversations. And through the continuation of this practice of going to yoga, feeling safe for a while, and then the nervous system being relaxed and the social engagement system on board, those individuals could learn over time to feel safer and safer. And that system gets stronger and stronger. And suddenly it's like, oh, I can just like have friends and talk to people and feel relaxed and safe throughout my daily life. And this is something that has 100% happened to me. The more often you practice, the better you feel about who you are. And then suddenly you think, oh, I can have friends and I can be on stage giving lectures to, like, in my case, to big audiences. And I feel fine because that system starts to change.
Yeah, no, I'm with you on that. I can definitely see the sort of the positive chat that comes on the way out of yoga and going, okay, this has been mediated by this process, and feel good about oneself. And I guess a danger that I've seen in the mindfulness research world, people cherry picking, they pick studies that support, because we love, I love meditation, I love yoga. It's very easy for me to share a Facebook post of this study says that meditation is great for you. But I wouldn't share a study. I wouldn't go looking for a study that said, okay, meditation might not be so great for you all the time. Like there's studies that show that, meditation isn't good for you under certain conditions, for example. But I'm wondering if there's anything out there which shows that yoga could be bad for us. I mean, not just physically, obviously there's the injury side of things, but when I come across a certain sort of neurotic controllingness, particularly in certain types of yoga. And I'm wondering if that isn't actually increased by yoga practice. Do you know what I'm talking about intuitively?
Yeah, I definitely know what you're talking about. And I can't say that no negative psychological effects could come from yoga. But yet, I'm not familiar with any research or anybody looking at that. When we talk about the dangers within meditation and mindfulness, we're primarily talking about two things. One is that individuals sitting quietly with their mind actually increase their amount of rumination and negative thoughts because they can't interrupt them in the first place. And the other is, and that can happen for people early, but it's supposed to be something that happens after people have been practicing for a significant amount of time, is suddenly reality doesn't have that concretized sense that it does. And that's terrifying, and that's something like a real spiritual aspirant would come across, but it can happen earlier for people. In yoga, in the physical practice of yoga, I should say, those things are much less of a risk. The mind's much more engaged, and it's very focused on groundedness by and large because of the physical element of it. Yeah, I guess, if somebody like Iyengar is a system of yoga that's very, very focused on being exact in terms of your posture. So there's that risk, I guess, just like there's a risk in absolutely everything we do, us using it in a negative way. You could drink too much water and it could be bad for you. Like everything has that potential. I think that yoga doesn't really come with those risks, aside from what you just mentioned, which are the physical ones. But of course, the wrong practice for somebody can be harmful. Like some of the lifting breathing practices, for example, if you're prone to schizophrenia, or if you have bipolar disorder or something like that, that's not going to be helpful for you. Or if you have an eating disorder and you secretly use yoga, which is meant to connect you with your body as another form of losing weight, it's going to be problematic. But I don't think that inherently yoga is dangerous in that way. I think it's just people can always use things in the wrong way.
Yeah, I think generally I'm of the position that yoga is generally good for people. And I guess there's also so many kinds of yoga and so many ways to do it, even within one style, that, I've heard of doctors, for example, saying, hey, you need to relax, go to a yoga class. And then someone goes to extreme hot power yoga as their kind of, because it says yoga on the front cover. Or someone that's really OCD going to Iyengar might not be the best fit. So I guess I always have a question for people I'm working with, which is like, okay, does this deepen your pattern that you already have, the neurosis you already have, because we all have one, or does it actually give you more increased behavioral flexibility? Because it strikes me that's the key thing, that people are consciously picking a way of doing yoga and a style of yoga which is actually really helping them.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And that's why it's good if somebody is going to yoga, for example, and they might not have someone to bounce ideas off of like you. What I say instead is, wherever I'm speaking, try lots of different teachers and lots of different classes. And you will find one where at the end you feel at peace. And that's your answer. That's where you should be going, But in the long term, right, I agree with you. If you're becoming more entrenched in your way of thinking, then it's not the right system.
And feeling of peace could just be feeling most comfortable, and we're most comfortable. Everyone likes the smell of their own brand, right? We're most comfortable, and this I think is a danger in a world where there's so much yoga, so many different types of yoga available in, say, Brighton or London, where you are, that we can pick one which just feels very comfortable.
But I think in the beginning that's okay, actually, even if we're further entrenched in our own way of doing things. In the very beginning, there's this idea, window of tolerance. If we're totally healthy and well, maybe we can go anywhere and just try it out and be exploratory. But if we're working for our health, which is my area of focus as a yoga therapist, I would want somebody in the beginning to feel safe and relaxed, not push their boundaries too much, and then find that they have that sense of grounding and then take that into, okay, let's go to the edge a little bit. Otherwise, I think it could be harmful for people. So I do suggest that they feel comfortable, even if that's what the piece is, just feeling comfortable, that's good too. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess if it's yoga for kind of stabilization, if someone's having mental health issues, that's particularly important rather than wanting another challenge when their life's challenging enough. So I totally get that.
Yeah.
How much is the mindfulness aspect the critical piece? I mean, is it that would any mindful movement be as good for people as yoga? If it was just mindful tango dancing, or mindful, I don't know, whatever, Zumba, or is it the posture specifically, you think?
I know that people would definitely disagree with me, some people, that, any mindful movement is good because the greatest benefit is the joy you feel in doing a practice, and it's irrelevant what that is. I don't agree. One of the things I actually lecture on is what makes yoga so unique, right? Because if you think about it, it has mindfulness, and mindfulness has mindfulness. It has movement, and every form of exercise has movement. It has stretching, and stretching also has stretching. It has controlled breathing, and Tai Chi and Qigong have movement and controlled breathing. So, is yoga any better than anything else? Isn't it just a matter of preference? I don't think so. I think that when you combine controlled breathing with stretching, which has very particular actual and very interesting physiological effects, with movement that involves starting and stopping, that we know engenders also specific kinds of effects in the brain, and actually gives rise to, from that kind of muscular physical flexibility, gives rise to mental flexibility. And you also combine that with the social support piece and everything else that comes together. Yoga becomes something that is, as a combined practice, unlike anything else. And I know that I'm biased, but I think that in so having all of those different aspects, it's, I hate to say this, but I can't help it. It's somewhat superior. I'm sorry, people that don't agree. I apologize. Probably you feel that way about your own, but I don't think that I came to yoga and teaching it and then got really excited and was like, I want to prove that yoga is the best. I think it was really the other way around. It was like, okay, I've been trying everything, and I'm still screwed up. What really, really helps? And yoga just was like all packed together in one.
There is a risk, I think, in that most people I know involved in yoga or mindfulness research are really, it's really helped them, like genuinely it's helped them in their life, and that can lead to this trying to prove something point of view. And I'd love to see a study which compared exercise with mindful exercise, with sitting mindfulness, with yoga, and yoga with a breath orientation. Like I feel like you actually need to sort of 5 or 6 groups that you need to compare. And my intuition is something in the holism of it. For me, the lack of a partner practice means that, while it may be superior, I think there may be things that are superior still to it, actually, in terms of lacking a partner practice generally, though I know it's not, not always the case in yoga. But it'd be interesting to sort of see a study which really helps separate those pieces out.
Yeah, I think you're right. And if we found that something else was better, or if we found out that people's proclivity defined what the best thing was for them and it wasn't inherent necessarily the practice, hey, I would own that. But to do a study like you're talking about and to be able to tease all of that out, first of all, we'd need like big numbers in each group. We'd need lots of people. And more than that, we need loads and loads of money. But hopefully in the future, we will have access to that information, because ultimately my goal, and I'm sure your goal, and the goal of a lot of other people using these mind-body therapies to help people, is finding the most effective way to help bring somebody to wellness.
Yeah,
we have to reduce our attachment to what that is and just be really interested in what's useful for that person.
Yeah. I think it's one of my aims with this podcast is to sort of present different approaches that are out there, because it's easy to get provincial about these things.
Yeah.
Also, just while I'm at it, I'd point listeners to Ariana Rabinovich's episode on yoga research and Helen Payne's episode on dance movement therapy and research around that. If people like this one, they're going to like those two. How close are we to actually sort of integrating yoga and meditation into something like the national healthcare system?
I'm probably not the best person to talk about meditation, although it may be mindfulness, but also not the best person to speak about that particular piece, because I'm not looking at that as much. But I can say this: because of the all-party parliamentary group on mindfulness and the work of those individuals, the UK has been more successful at integrating mindfulness into society over any other country in the entire world. So that's pretty cool. In terms of the integration of yoga, and that is my remit, I think that it's really going. I think that we're in a position, and I'm very excited about that, to be the leader in this, just like mindfulness is for the rest of the world. So in terms of healthcare systems, it's happening in little pockets. I am involved in a social prescribing evaluation in the West London Clinical Commissioning Group to see how a 10-week social prescribing yoga intervention helps people with mild depression, anxiety, social isolation, prediabetes, and at risk for heart disease. I know that various other people are having impacts in their local NHS catchment regions. I've been working on bringing breathing into West London, and that's really taken off like wildfire because, again, pranayama is so easy to integrate into daily life, especially if it's like a really simple pranayama. In terms of the education system, there's an impressive amount of integration and various different ways in both primary and secondary schools. In the criminal justice sector, I think, Sam Saddle of the Prison Phoenix Trust, which is the main organization that brings yoga and also meditation to prisoners. I think they said 6% of all UK prisoners practice yoga. I think that's the highest statistic for a prison population practicing anywhere in the world. So that's really, really amazing. And I think it says great things about the potential to reduce reoffending. And also within the occupational health sector, there's quite a lot of companies that offer yoga classes. In fact, today I have a meeting with the assistant for the CEO of Aetna Insurance to talk about how he integrated yoga into the company at large. And, myself and a bunch of other people have been involved in the creation of an all-party parliamentary group on yoga. And its main aim is to continue to do the work of bringing yoga into British society. And I think it's happening. And I think that if it happens at a deeper, more profound, pervasive level, that we will find ourselves in a position of positive change. I really hope so. More pro-social behavior, feeling better, preventing diseases, managing them more effectively. And imagine if our leaders did yoga. Maybe they would
Justin from Canada does, but
yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Justin was, I can't pronounce his second name, the ghastly liberal, good-looking boy from Canada. He does. I know he's quite a reasonable. I saw him do a fairly serious Ashtanga posture in a suit, so he's clearly a reasonable practitioner.
Mm-hmm.
I just dream of a world where it's normal for children to be meditating in schools. There's one mindfulness school in Brighton, a specific school, but to see it, integrated. My niece has come across this work as an 8-year-old in Peterborough, which is a fairly provincial town.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't led by me. This was just people she was in contact with there. And when something reaches Peterborough, I go, okay, that's, for listeners out there, that's kind of like the Midwest or something,
Mm-hmm.
Her to be coming across it in school, I was like, okay, this stuff must be spreading. And I've definitely had friends that have come across this in prisons now. It's definitely there and available. So yeah, and I heard you were in the House of Commons, fancy pants. That sounded like that sounded pretty cool.
Thank you. Yeah, it's cool. It's cool, but more than that, it's exciting to be able to be involved in the process of engendering change. I really want to see that. I want to see our world to be a better place. I think it's possible.
I was in the House of Lords briefly for a trauma thing, and I was quite nervous. I was waiting in the changing room. It's like a cloakroom, I should say. And there was all these famous politicians there, like Neil Kinnock and people that I'd grown up with who'd sort of got older and become lords, which is like, for those listening, it's sort of like the Senate, I guess you'd say, in the UK. And then a Buddhist monk walks in, and he was from the same Theravadan tradition that I'm trained in. I sort of talked to him, and he knew an abbot that I knew. And it turned out that this Buddhist monk had been advising various people in there for quite some time. And I thought to myself, you know what? There's hope. There's hope. If me and this guy are in here on any given day of the week, then things are far from ideal. There's
When was this?
was a few years back. Yeah, this was
Cool.
about 4 years back. I was just briefly.
What Buddhist monk? I'm sorry for being nosy, but I'm really curious.
He was the abbot of one of the Theravada monasteries in the north of England. His name eludes me. It's a Pali name. But
Okay.
yeah, he was a personal friend of some of the lords and just happened to be in there chatting and giving a bit of advice on a few things. So that was a sort of reassurance, because I was dead nervous about being the only hippie in the building. And I kind of went, okay, there's some hope here. So it's nice. It's more than nice. It's very gratifying to see the spread of these practices. I feel like integrating within society is the key challenge for this work now.
Mm-hmm. It is, but I think it's going to happen.
Yeah, it is happening.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it's just an understanding of what we need to do, best practice, and also appreciating the needs of society rather than dictating, like, this is how yoga should be. I think we need to be really flexible, and we need to work within the systems present.
Yeah, is there a danger in sort of fully buying into a kind of scientific worldview? Because sometimes it seems like, to have studies to tell you yoga's relaxing, for example, and, to talk about the GABA or whatever it is, the neuroplasticity, it's like, it's kind of funny that yogis like me and you are talking about this stuff now, like, because we know this, right? We know this experientially. We've experienced it ourselves. We've seen it in enough students. And on the one hand, I get that it's helpful to present it to, say, politicians or the healthcare system as evidence-based. But there's also a way in which that feels like I'm buying into a system or giving the authority somewhere where I don't want to give the authority. It's a disembodying thing for me to say the authority rests within the evidence base rather than my own experience. That's disempowering, I would say.
I get you. I mean, listen, I just got back from a week living in an ashram in the Bahamas. And when I'm sitting there and practicing, I'm not thinking, well, how much GABA am I creating right now? Is there more BDNF? What's happening to my inflammatory factors? That's why I'm doing this. I mean, I know the effects of yoga because I know how it feels in my body. I know I feel healthier. I know I feel happier. I know I feel connected to something larger than myself, which is certainly something I can't imagine quantifying. You can say that people feel connected to something larger than themselves. Being able to actually quantify what that is, that's a whole other kettle of fish. But I guess I'm not really uncomfortable with this other way of doing it. I know it's reductionist, and I know that it doesn't speak to the grander power of yoga. And I also know that some yogis would really fight against the idea of reducing yoga down to those research studies. But this is how I see it. If wise beings throughout history have always had to alter the way that they've offered teachings to individuals that met the mindset of those individuals. The same is true when we try to approach different institutions that are already established and the working infrastructure within our countries and our world. And if the language that we need to speak and the way that we need to express what yoga can do in order for it to be uptaken by the wider public or in institutions needs to be reductionist, I'm okay with that, because ultimately, as soon as you practice yoga, anything that is reductionist about it suddenly shifts to being grander and more inclusive. I mean, that's the nature of the actual practice. The rest is just the wording around it. So I think we do what we can, and yoga will do the rest.
Yeah, I think there's a trust there. I guess I call that skillful means, what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And, there's a humility in saying, you know what, I don't need the mala beads, like not being so attached to certain things that might just get in the way with people. Listen, I'm looking at the time and we're nearly on time here. Mm-hmm. You've got loads of cool stuff online. So where can people find out more about some of this research and some of the courses that you put on?
So our courses, you can go to themindedinstitute.com. On our Facebook group, which is Yoga Therapy for the Mind at the Minded Institute. I know it's a super long name. Apparently you can't change it once you've decided on it, or I can't figure it out. If any of the listeners know how to do that, please tell me. But every day we publish, or we don't publish, but we comment on published research. So it's a really good place to find out about anything that's come out. And also, myself and a bunch of other people founded the Yoga and Healthcare Alliance. And if you're interested in how to bridge the worlds of yoga and healthcare, you might want to look at that website and get in touch. And then there's also the political aspect, the all-party parliamentary group on yoga and society. So you can also get in touch around that. You can write through the Yoga and Healthcare Alliance, and the admin for that will get back to you. And I hope more than anything that you're inspired to kind of share the love, as well as to people who you thought would never try yoga. And you would be surprised that in presenting it in a way that maybe aligns with how they see the world, and that's probably more research or medical based, that they'll be open. I found it.
Heather, thank you so much for joining us today. Much appreciated.
My pleasure, Mark. It was really nice to speak with you.
Loads of gifts for people listening there, loads of good stuff. So I hope people look up more. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Subscribe to get more. And you can also leave us a review on iTunes, which helps with our rankings. So really appreciate that. Equally, if you want to support the podcast even more, then fund us. Go to Patreon. Give us $1 per episode. Those who don't know, Patreon's a really good way of supporting things you want to see more of in the world. I know so much is available for free now, and what I'd say is a lot of energy and effort goes into this podcast. I put it out there for free so everyone can get it. Maud and I work on this. Everyone that wants it can have it for free. And if you want to support us, it is really appreciated. So it's patreon.com/Mark Walsh. And of course, if you want any in-person training, you can visit embodiedfacilitator.com. There's loads more resources there too.
Till next time, welcome home to the body.